a mild direction. But as we go through Wednesday and Thursday, it's this weather front that we're keeping close eyes on. That's going to bring some heavy rain, and we've got weather warnings in place. That rain is currently situated across parts of Scotland, and that's going to gradually trickle its way southwards as we go through Tuesday evening and overnight, becoming quite persistent then across parts of northwest England into southwest Scotland. A rain warning in force here. But these are your overnight temperatures as we start Wednesday morning. These are more typical of what we should be seeing by daytime at this stage in October. So some heavy rain through the morning going to be pushing its way in. Persistent as well, some difficult travelling conditions and the risk of some flooding as that rain starts to accumulate through the day. To the south of it, it's very mild, a few breaks in the cloud to the east of the Pennines, across parts of southeast England as well. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud around, but highs of 18 degrees, 64 Fahrenheit, exceptionally high for this time of year. A few showers also coming in across western Scotland. Now that rain continues to track its way slowly south and eastwards as we go through Wednesday night, becoming more persistent across Wales then through Thursday. So we have a rain warning developing here through the day. As I say, we could see a large amount of rain piling up over the next few days. Still very mild though as we start Thursday morning, 12 to 14 degrees, but a little bit cooler up towards the northwest where we see some clearer skies. Then through Thursday, it's a case of spot the difference. Further wet weather to come across these western areas, only slowly making its progress eastwards through the day. Some brighter spells elsewhere and a few showers. Staying unsettled then as we look towards the weekend. Temperatures coming down on Saturday. Bye-bye.
Good evening and welcome. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Michelle Dewberry and this is Dewbs & Co, the show where we get into the stories that have got you talking today. Coming up, the true cost of government's Plan B has been leaked. I want to know. I'll tell you what it is shortly. But is it worth it? And in another leak, someone's not happy about leaks today, I can tell you. We've learnt that the public sector pay freeze will be lifted. Is that the right decision? And as one MP faces a potential suspension, I'm asking, should MPs be allowed to have second jobs? All of that and lots more coming up. But first, let's get you up to date with the news headlines.
I'm Polly Middlehurst and here are your GB News headlines. Millions of public sector workers will get a pay rise next year. That includes teachers, nurses and police officers. The Chancellor is due to announce the change for workers across the country in tomorrow's budget. And that comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increase after heavy borrowing during the pandemic. However, Labour's shadow child poverty minister, Wes Streeting, criticised the latest budget announcements, including the national minimum wage increase.
The minimum wage increase doesn't go anywhere near far enough to compensating people for those losses. In fact, we calculated that even when you take into account the minimum wage increase, once you've factored in the universal credit cut, once you've factored in the national insurance hike, people end up being still about £800 a year worse off. And by definition, these are people on some of the lowest incomes when they go out to work.
The number of patients in hospital with COVID has climbed to its highest level for more than 7 months. A total of 8,693 patients were hospitalised before October the 25th. That's according to the latest government figures. However, levels are still well below those seen at the peak of the second wave of coronavirus. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has announced that double-jabbed travellers to the country will be able to take a lateral flow test on the second day of their trip. That aligns with England's current rules. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said that while the situation has greatly improved in Scotland since August, it remains fragile as the country heads into its winter period. Ms Sturgeon also said delegates attending the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow inevitably poses the risk of coronavirus spreading.
The hosting of COP would always have been a significant challenge given the scale of the event for the UK and Scottish governments and for Glasgow City Council. However, the fact that it is happening amidst a global pandemic obviously makes it even more challenging. And it is inevitably the case that an event of this scale poses a risk of increased COVID transmission.
The UN has warned the world is on track for a climate catastrophe and that plans to cut emissions still fall far short of what's needed. The organisation's environment programme said even with plans and pledges from countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the next decade, the world faces global warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. The former Cabinet Minister, Owen Paterson, faces a 30-day ban from Parliament for breaking lobbying rules. That's after an investigation by the Parliamentary Committee on Standards into Paterson's lobbying for 2 companies he was a consultant for. The committee say they found an egregious case of paid advocacy. Downing Street has said a motion to suspend Paterson will be moved in the Commons following the usual procedure. The former Cabinet Minister, however, rejects the findings. Sussex Police say they're investigating 7 cases of women being injected or spiked on nights out. The reports have all come from Brighton and Eastbourne in the last week, and detectives have said they want to reassure members of the public to increase their patrols in the affected areas. The mother of 2 murdered sisters, Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, have dismissed an apology from the Metropolitan Police. The force has apologised to the family for their initial response to reports they were missing, saying it came below the standard it should have achieved. The sisters were found dead in a North London park in June last year. Daniel Hussain will be sentenced for their double murder this week. The former Rangers manager, Walter Smith, has died at the age of 73. He led Rangers to 10 wins in top titles, as well as to the UEFA Cup final in 2008. In his career, he also managed the Scottish national side and Everton. The club chairman, Douglas Park, said that Walter will be sorely missed by all of us at Rangers. Now, SpaceX has had a leak, but not of confidential information this time. Instead, the company has revealed issues with toilet plumbing on board some of its capsules. At the launch of the company's first private flight last month, a toilet tube in the rocket became unglued, spraying unfortunate onlookers with its contents. SpaceX and NASA are now tackling these toilet troubles, as they're calling them, ahead of its new launch on Sunday. That's all your news for now. I'm back in half an hour.
Thank you, Polly. Now, before we begin, we have an update from Buckingham Palace. The Queen will not attend COP26. She's been advised to rest by her doctors. We'll have more information on that story later on. But joining me tonight to debate the stories are journalist and author Ella Whelan, political editor of the Sunday Mirror Nigel Nelson, and Peter Edwards, former editor of the Labour List. But you know the drill by now on this show as well. It's not just about us. We also like to hear from you tonight. Get in touch. Let me know what you think about all the stories and topics that we covered tonight. You can email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at GBNews, or you know by now, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. We are everywhere. Get in touch for all of these topics. And of course, I've just mentioned to you there about the Queen. What do you think when you hear that she's not attending COP26? Do you care? Does it matter to you? We had a very, very brief debate here for a moment with split opinions, but she is, after all, 95. Isn't she entitled to a bit of a break? Let me know your thoughts on that. First up, our top story, Plan B. Of course, these measures, you hear this sentence all the time, Plan B, this label, what is it? These are the measures that include mandatory mask wearing, COVID certification and work from home guidance. Well, there's been this whole tug of war, should they be in, shouldn't they be in, what are we going to do? And now a leaked report has suggested that a 5-month switch to the government's Plan B measures would cost the economy, or could cost the economy, as much as £18 billion. That basically is more than £800 million a week. The report reveals that ministers have considered enforcing these measures throughout winter until March 2022. What do you think to that? I'm going to start with you, Nigel. Plan B. There's so much debate at the moment about should we be doing it, shouldn't we? What's your thoughts?
We should be doing it. We made the mistake last year when we were dithering around what to do, and finally we ended up with a lockdown over Christmas. And my fear is that without Plan B, we'll end up with a lockdown this Christmas. So what I'd like to see is to avoid the lockdowns. But if you don't, in the words of Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, if you don't hit early and hard, you miss your window. And at the moment, you're talking about infections have been going down slightly, but we're still 10 times more than Italy, 7 times more than France. Germany has got a third of our infections. We're not doing very well. And if we don't do something dramatic now, then we'll pay for it later, and it'll cost an awful lot more than 18 billion.
So that's a yes from you. Peter, I want to just mention, bring you in, because former Labour List, we've seen Keir Starmer now finally have an opinion on something. His opinion is on this, yes, we should be doing it. Should we?
Yes, I think it's very likely, and I think there's a lot to be said for it. To be fair to Keir Starmer, he called for a lockdown last November time. The government eventually did it, so he's had several opinions, and I won't rehash Labour conference. I think the government is wrestling with itself because it's got its right-wing libertarian ideology. It doesn't want to restrict freedom. No one should care about that. Not care about libertarian values. I think it's wrestling with the economy. That's a serious point because recession costs lives, costs jobs, costs housing, costs health. And then also think it's worried about the polling and the political impact of another lockdown. As Nigel said, last year, the problem wasn't that we had a Christmas lockdown. It was yes, no, on again, off again. And then finally, as everyone expected, lockdown was brought in at Christmas. So I think what the government needs to do is act with clarity, take the politics out of it, and this sounds old-fashioned now, a year into the pandemic, carry on listening to the science, because I'm not sure they are.
Right, Ella, I hope you're going to speak some sense. I'm pinning all my hopes. That's why I've come to you last. I like to hold the common sense until the end.
Well, it's a bit too generous, but I completely disagree with both my fellow panellists because we know that, and talk about listening to the science, we know that at the moment the people who are suffering from very bad illness and unfortunately who are dying are those who haven't had, in the most part, are those who haven't had the vaccine, or indeed people in the vulnerable or elderly group who haven't had their booster yet. So I would not implement Plan B, but what I would do is urge the government to really put the gas on when it comes to continuing to push the vaccine rollout. They've kind of taken their eye off the ball on that. We've had problems with rolling out the booster jabs. We know that that is the most, and particularly the booster jab being a very high percentage effectiveness of preventing very serious illness and indeed having a large effect on transmission. Why aren't we talking about the success of the vaccine any longer? We seem to now have reverted to this very lazy approach, I have to say, that the government has, whereas when in doubt, go for a coercive measure. I can't stress enough. I mean, I disagree with Peter on the idea that the government's got a kind of right-wing libertarian bent. I think, if anything, the government hasn't respected the principle of freedom enough. You know, how many times do we have to list things like the massive waiting list for cancer treatment, the horrendous situation that continues to happen in care homes in relation to people not being able to see their family members, dementia patients deteriorating, you know, people losing their jobs. People think that the furlough scheme and working from home was some kind of holiday for most people. Well, actually, it was most people's personal hell, juggling childcare and your job working on Zoom. You know, all of what happened in the last 18 months was a serious thing that was, you know, in the context of an emergency and a virus that we knew nothing about way back in 2020 was acceptable, and lots of us accepted it, and there was a high level of support for the government's measures, and people understood that. But now, when we know all that we do, and most importantly, when we have the vaccine, the idea of reverting back to, you know, things that sound frivolous, like mandatory mask wearing. People say, why would you be so bothered about wearing a mask? But social distancing, you know, being away from each other, and in particularly working from home, which has a knock-on effect of city centres, it has a knock-on effect of people's mental health. You know, we know all of this. Bringing that back in is no small thing.
Yeah, well, it's not, and it's no cheap thing either. As I just mentioned, up to 18 billion. I'm just going to show you now some of the costs of COVID so far, so we don't lose sight in terms of the economics of this. And yes, people will say it's not just about economics, but nonetheless, they are an important factor. £370 billion, that is the cost of COVID so far. That's according to the source, that is the National Audit Office. Now, one of the things, I mean, I make my views clear every day on this show. I'm completely against COVID vaccines. I don't support mask mandation. Is mandation a word, by the way? I say it every night, and every time I say it, I'm never sure, but mandate, mask mandate, I don't support them. But I wonder now why we've not got a little bit more sophisticated with the way that we track the data, because I'm surprised that still all this time on, you know, we're almost 2 years into this now, we still talk about a COVID death as being someone who's died, obviously very sadly, but died within 28 days of having a test, irrespective in many cases of why they died or how they died. We still talk about number of cases as though that is the significant value, but we don't ever actually look at that in comparison to the amount of tests and volume of tests. So you mentioned lots of other countries, and you compare our death rate, for example, or cases to other countries. But actually, when you actually look at how much we test significantly more than many, if not most, countries. And the percentage, the cases as a percentage of testing is actually not that bad, I would say. But so why are we still so unsophisticated in our data?
But the issue is not about those things. The issue is the NHS becoming overwhelmed. It's been the issue right from the start.
Well, then you need to sort the NHS out. That's not.
Well, we're not going to do it overnight. So the NHS has got to be able to operate. And at the moment, this is where I disagree with Ella, when you're talking about jabs being the kind of panacea for everything, an awful lot of double jab people are ending up in hospital at the moment.
They are indeed.
So the big figure that you need to look at is the number of people who are actually in hospital, and especially those who end up in intensive care units. Mm-hmm. And if that goes too high, then the NHS won't be able to cope.
Do you think the data is clear? I'm going to stick with my data theme for a second, if you'll indulge me. So if I come to your point and apply data to it, we talk about the number of people in intensive care or in hospital with COVID. We don't know if they're there because of COVID.
Well, we do.
For example,
we know that a quarter of ICU beds are made up of COVID patients.
Of people with COVID?
At the moment,
But are they there because of COVID? So, for example, because I get asked this question, and I have tried to find the answer to it, which is why I'm raising it. If someone, for example, had a car accident and ended up in ICU and just happened to test positive for COVID, that's not really a COVID person in ICU, is it?
But I mean, I think there's a small percentage of people where that would be the case. But, you know, Nigel is right. There is a significant, and Peter is right, there's a significant number of people who are still very sick with this. And there is a problem with the NHS capacity being pushed, which, as we have to remember, it is every year. The question I think the pressure we should be putting on the government is to say, where are your resources for, you know, things like the Nightingale Hospital? You know, we've had now a period of time in which, you know, it seems ridiculous and unfair on people to repeat the same same mistakes, which essentially we are doing if we bring in Plan B or lockdown measures. Because let's remember, the idea that we act restrictively on people's lives in order to save the NHS is a failing. It's a failing of the NHS. Nigel's completely right that that's not going to be fixed overnight. You're not suddenly going to have, you know, an army of new staff who aren't knackered after the last 18 months marching in to save us. But it's I think, I keep using the word unfair, I think it's a travesty that the government has been allowed to fail again and use coercive measures, whether they be in the form of vaccine passports, not vaccines, but vaccine passports, or mandatory mask wearing, or indeed restricting us to our homes and not being allowed to go out around Christmas time. That is a failing of government. And there are other ways, whether it be shielding, as I've already mentioned, the vaccine rollout, and also provision of measures using Nightingale hospitals, using resources in order to not have a repeat of the disaster that was last year.
But we're not going to have a repeat. It's going to be different because the vaccine rate is higher. There's still a lot of risks, whether it's of lockdown or of health or economic damage. But Michelle, you said, if I heard you right, you're against COVID vaccines.
No, I did not. You absolutely did not hear me right. I am against making a vaccine, the COVID vaccine, mandatory.
OK, that's not quite what you said. So that's a fair point.
Well, hang on, let me issue a question there, because that is a very important point.
Yeah.
If I said I'm against the COVID vaccine, I need to be very clear that is not what I meant. If you want to have a vaccine, if you want to have 2, if you want to have 3, if you want to keep going, that is your business. I'm absolutely in favour of personal choice. I am absolutely, every inch of me, against vaccine mandates.
OK, so what do we now... Because I think Ella raised 2 really good questions I think government are struggling to answer, that at the top end of the age spectrum, we're having a third round, a booster round, but that's coming too late.
Yeah.
So I suspect that ship has sailed. But then the other end of the age spectrum, people under 30, under 25, where there's either hesitancy or just people refusing, we know that they're just as much at risk if you're stuck on 0 vaccines. What do we do about that? Because perhaps someone who's a bit more libertarian-minded, that's a real challenge. Without mandating it, how does the state incentivise young people to get the jab? Because that will benefit all of us.
But coercion is... I completely appreciate the point that you're making, which is that we have this problem of people... And, you know, you could say at this point, but someone who doesn't want the jabs probably, you could argue, might not be likely to get it, however much persuasion. But coercion in the form of mandates only, I think, deepens a conspiratorial view that people have about the vaccine. If you are open with people and trust them and say to them, look, here is all the expert opinion, and also, you know, your auntie's got it, your friend's got it, what's wrong with you getting it? If you have that conversation, people are, and expressively kind of put focus on the social nature of what we're dealing with, then I think people are, it comes down to whether you think the public's trustworthy or not. And I think the success of the vaccine rollout so far has shown that most people are sensible and sensitive to the challenges we face. Keep pushing that positive line, and I think you'll get success. But if you start coercing people and bringing in the kind of shackles in the form of vaccine mandates, I think it's going to have the opposite effect.
I would agree with that I think it's wrong to have a jab for a job. I think a job working is a right. But if it comes down, you think that vaccine passports are also coercive. Is that right?
I think that what it does is it, as you know, Jacinda Ardern's been in the news, you know, for her sort of flippant describing of society as being formed into 2 sections. I mean, those who've been jabbed and those who haven't. In all other jabs, whether it be flu jabs, whether it be other vaccinations or inoculations, we have a sense that what you do is you inoculate and vaccinate a certain percentage of the country in order to protect those who don't want to, or for religious reasons or whatever reasons, can't get the vaccine. I know that we're in different times and coronavirus is a very specific thing, but we seem to have let go or forgotten about that very, that sort of freedom-loving and tolerant nature of the way in which we deal with these things.
Are you against passports or not?
I am against passports because I think what they do is it limits people's freedom of choice and it actually removes the freedom of choice. But in specific contexts...
Yeah, but it is choice. I mean, if you need a passport to get into a nightclub, it's your choice in the first place to go to the nightclub.
Exactly.
You don't have to go to the nightclub.
Nightclub is not essential activity. If a supermarket was doing it, that would be a different matter. And that's why I think some of the fear about restrictions is a little bit overdone when talking about restrictions on individual freedom, because I think whether you're right-wing or left-wing, we're never going to ever end up in a place where it's a criminal offence not to have a vaccine.
Well,
no government would do that. But just to finish that point, they're going to be... Ella talked about incentives. I think incentives are gradually going to trip over into restrictions. So at the start,
You don't have to.
You can come in here if you have a jab, but then that's changing, obviously, so you can't come in here if you don't have a jab. And I think we're moving that way, but it's never going to be criminalised. So I just want to be proportionate, because I think these are... I don't feel these are infringements. I feel these are adjustments to the worst pandemic in centuries.
I don't know, maybe you guys don't like clubbing as much as I do, but, you know, and talk about the spread. Talking about the spread, you know, what about pubs? What about restaurants? What about when this gets onto... And Nigel mentioned jobs. You know, there are the suggestion that there'll be some jobs you can't do going into someone's house without a jab. You then have a very serious problem on your hands.
Well, there you go. Different opinions here. And by the way, if anyone's interested in reading that leaked report, it's available widely online, and it concludes in this report that the figures suggest that certification would reduce what they call overall community transition by 1 to 5%. Anyway, I'll leave it there. You guys have been getting in contact. Lots of you fired up about this topic. Ron makes a very good pointing out to me here. Ron says, I keep saying what it's going to cost the government. It won't cost the government anything. It'll cost the taxpayers. Very good point there, Ron. Well done. Anyway, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be looking at one Tory MP faced suspension after working as a consultant for 2 firms. Should members of Parliament be able to have a second job? We'll have that and more after the break. Welcome back. Now, more than 5 million public sector workers are set to receive a salary increase next year as Rishi Sunak announced the end of the public sector pay freeze. The amount that they get will depend on how much the independent review boards recommend. Also, the national living wage will be increased from £8.91 to £9.50 an hour. Alas, many people are angry, saying that these are not real pay rises at all. They reference inflation and the cost of living rises. But I want to know then, when you take all of that into account, you look at the rises, and of course we don't yet know the figures for the public sector, are they a pay rise? Is it enough, Peter?
No, and remember, the Labour Party campaigned for a national minimum wage for 100 years, and the Tories fought it for 100 years. A Labour Party in government delivered it, but now it's not going up enough. As you rightly said, inflation risks eating away at it. We've had a universal credit cut now going into winter, going into perhaps another spike in the pandemic. This is a terrible time for working people, and that's before you get into the budget leaks where we're talking about a quote-unquote rise for public sector workers, which risks being chipped away at by inflation as well as spending cuts elsewhere in the NHS.
But
this is not a great day for the government.
Wasn't Labour talking about £15 a as the minimum wage. Am I making that up? Was that the figure that I was?
There was a big internal debate at Labour conference between £10 and £15.
£15. I mean, to me, my background is business, and I just think if you start talking about minimum wages of £15, yes, OK, you might increase the wage of some people's jobs, but you will also impact the number of jobs significantly and the number of businesses that are able to expand. I think the £15 is bonkers.
Michelle, that's the argument, just quickly on that if you pay people fairly, that's the argument that's been used for 100 years by the Tories, and it was disproven emphatically by the Blair-Brown government when employment rose when he brought in a national minimum wage.
Of what?
Labour Party had a big debate.
What did he bring it up to?
It didn't exist. There was no minimum wage. You could be in 1997, when I worked in a shop in a sixth form, you could be paid £1 an hour. Right? That's why I'm not giving the Tories any credit for this. They've taken a Labour policy and run with it.
£15. You don't believe that £15 minimum wage would increase the number of jobs? You don't believe that if you say to a start-up organisation, you now have to pay £15 an hour, you think that wouldn't have an impact on the number of jobs?
I don't think it is Labour policy to have it as high as 15, and I'm going to turn to
Nigel.
Nigel.
No, it's 10. It is 10. That
10.
the official policy is £10. A lot of pressure at Labour conference for 15, but it wasn't accepted by the leadership.
Good. Sensible. That's sensible. I like that. What's your thoughts on that?
You think that's sensible? I mean, I'm not sure I could live on £10 an hour.
I think it's sensible. Well, what I think, it's sensible that there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance which makes it affordable for people, plus affordable for the organisation to expand and create these jobs. Because if you create a level, and I'm sure someone will be able to fire in on what that level is, if you create the point where it is just unaffordable, unsustainable for an organisation to do this, you will A, lose jobs, or B, you'll just push up consumer prices. Because if you think an organisation is going to sit there and say, OK, yes, today's my minimum wage is £9.50, I tell you what, I'll make it £15 and I'll keep my price point the same, then you're deluded. What they do is, if they will be forced to do that, they will just pass that cost increase on to the consumer, and then you're back to where you started, because your £15 doesn't go half as well or
Michelle,
anywhere near what it used to.
There's no major political party in Britain calling for a £15 minimum wage an hour, even though I think £15 is not much, but there's no major party calling for that.
Anyway, if we can forget the mythical figure and stick with the real figure, which is, I think that the increase in the national living wage is welcome, but it has to be said, I don't often agree with West Streeting, but it is pennies when it comes to the situation that people find themselves in, particularly after, as we've just been rowing about, 18 months of hell and, furlough pay, which is a pay cut for most people. This is going to be peanuts. The larger question, though, is to talk about the fact that the living wage is only a very small portion of people's experience and a small portion of the problem with dealing with the economy.
Well, 2 million people get it, which actually they will benefit from the increase.
But I think we have to have a much broader problem with this government, and actually Labour governments previously, has been that there has been no ability to look at the long-term problems with the economy. So we know that one of the biggest issues is flatlining productivity across the last 10, 15, 20 years, which the pandemic has revealed some of it, the big problems in relation to the proliferation of, crappy, low-paid, low-value, precarious jobs. The government likes to boast about employment, but so many jobs on the market at the moment are, 0 hours, running around deliveries, or things that can be, removed from people in an instant. And instead, we are not having a conversation about how to get an economy that produces, yes, high-skill, high-wage jobs like the government likes to boast about, but a greater level of productivity, more security for people with more options when it comes to employment. Raising the living wage is only it's playing around with, and, as the government likes to talk about, balancing the books and giving a little bit of the slice of the pie here, a little slice of the pie there, instead of talking about growth and development. And, to bring in another issue, in the context, we're just about to run into COP26, in the context of a sort of enforced austerity under concerns about the environment, you have a picture that's very dire, a government that thinks spending, investing and growth is a kind of evil if it does something to the planet.
But what a radical government, whether it's actually left or right, doesn't matter, should be thinking about now is the economy needs a complete reset after COVID. So one of the things they could be looking at is 4-day weeks. 4-day weeks have actually increased productivity that you're talking about in Iceland, Sweden. They tried it in Colombia. It seems to work. France does it. France has a 34-hour week. and their productivity is an awful lot better than ours.
Yeah.
So it's things like that, these brave ideas that they should be looking at, because now we've got a perfect chance to introduce them.
Yeah, but I think you're exactly right that the pandemic has been terrible in many ways, but it also gives the onus on the government to come up with something. It's an opportunity to rethink things.
Yeah.
But what you need, Nigel, is a government with a bit of cojones, and we don't have a government that's willing to have a long-term plan or anything that goes beyond small penny pinching here. I mean, I think the narrative at the moment is, I've done a couple of discussions about this in relation to the Battle of Ideas Festival that I had. The whole discussion about the economy now is where should we cut? What needs to be trimmed? We've stopped talking about growth, about making things, about, widening people's horizons. We're now having a discussion of will we have to tighten up on energy bills or will we have to tighten up on the cost of food? I mean, what are we living in sort of 1920s?
But you're making a political point as well as an economic point, and I think they're fair in a sense, although we come from very different perspectives, which is productivity is really important, and every political party would accept that. But it's really hard to get any votes out of that, just like it's really hard to get any votes out of a 4-day week. And I'm not sure I'm persuaded. But imagine if the Labour Party leader went out and called for a 4-day week. The Tory attacks would just be colossal. And I remember years ago when Chukwuemeka, then a Labour frontbencher, said Labour should learn more from France about productivity, which is kind of a fair point, but it was just written up as we should be more like the French. And that's not a vote winner. So we've got to accept that there are very steep short-term political trade-offs about what is a kind of very sensible question to raise.
Starmer's just, Starmer, as you've said, is calling for everyone to work from home now. So there's, I think he's got a complete cowardice when it comes to talking about what people need in relation to employment. No, advocating for something that's wrecked people's job opportunities over the last 18 months. I mean, I'm not crying any tears for Labour at this.
But going back to the budget, to the original question, it is a pay rise. I mean, you can't get away from that. The trouble is, it's going to be eaten away by other things.
Yes. Well, I'm going to move on in a second. As much as we could carry this one, and we can carry all these debates on, but I want to get into the MP thing. But I just want to finish this conversation just by putting a few facts in as well. So we'll just talk about how many people are affected by this. The public sector, this is 5 million people will be getting rises there. The national living wage, talk about how many people are on that. It's 2.5 million people on the national living wage. Public sector earnings premium, so the difference between what you earn in the public sector versus the private sector. According to the ONS, you've got 7% premium for working in the public sector. The national living wage reflects a 6.6% rise. The private sector wages increase this year. The increases are a third lower than they were pre-crisis, and they currently stand at 1.8%. There's some facts for you. Right, let's move on. A Conservative MP and ex-Cabinet Minister faces a 30-day suspension from the House of Commons for apparently breaching lobbying rules. A parliamentary investigation found out that Owen Paterson, former Environment Minister, worked as a consultant not for one, but two consulting firms. Under the current law, MPs suspended for more than 10 days could lose their seats if their constituents decide to trigger a by-election. Paterson has insisted that he acted within the rules. Should MPs be allowed second jobs, Nigel?
No, but I mean, I think that the unpopular bit is you've got to start thinking about whether or not they're paid enough. Now, the argument would be they're paid a huge amount, £82,000, which is puts them in the top 5% of earners. But you have to think about the responsibilities they have, and they should be doing them full time. They're looking after 70, 80,000 constituents. It's a big job. They're running an office. And as a result, I think that the pay has actually lagged behind over the years. If you take
what do you think they should be paid?
Well, I don't know, in fact, on that one, because it's actually, it is the rate, if you're doing the rate in the private sector, you'd be looking at something like 150 grand or something like that. I don't think it should go as high as that. But if you make comparisons, the Prime Minister in the 1930s was paid £10,000. That would be 650,000 at today's money. And Boris Johnson gets £157,000. And there are people like the heads of local authorities, NHS chiefs who actually get more money than the Prime Minister. That can't be the right system. Unfortunately, though, as the Tories believe in the free market and supply and demand, there is a greater supply of people who want to be MPs than there are vacancies. And so probably you'd have enough people to do it for 40,000. But I think that their money is too low, but it's an unpopular thing to say.
Yeah, do you
My
agree?
Twitter's going off now.
Money is too low, according to Nigel. Do you agree?
No, this is perhaps a disagreement on the left. I think £82,000 is easily enough. I'm not sure the prime ministerial comparison quite stands up, because 80 or 90 years ago you were talking about prime ministers that were independently wealthy from their landed estate. They went back to their grouse moor in Scotland. It was a different scenario 100 years ago. Let's talk about MPs paid now. Who can't live on 82 grand a year? I'm not sure backbench MPs have that.
Plus expenses as well.
And people like Owen Paterson, or Paterson, I'm never sure how to say his surname, as an ex-cabinet minister, will have an enhanced parliamentary pension from being in the cabinet. I would ban all second jobs, and I think the one area I hesitate over is MPs, to be fair, on all sides, who've worked in the NHS, sometimes do things like helping out in their hospital at the weekend. So I think one has to be sensitive around things like that. But my challenge for any MP is, what is it about your £82,000 salary that you find so hard to live on?
Hello.
In relation to what's been alleged against Owen Paterson, I think more of the upset is about the fact that he has been, the rules have been broken around lobbying. It's not necessarily that he's being incredibly greedy and raking in the money, but it's that he's in his relationship with these two firms. In the abstract, away from Owen Paterson, I actually think that, and maybe this is where I'll try to out-left my two fellow panellists, that part of the problem with members of Parliament and their inability to grab the concept of democracy over the last 5-6 years is, I think, that they have, it's commonly known that they are out of touch with ordinary people or working class people, or however you want to put it. And I think that actually might not be a radical or a different solution to suggest that members of Parliament should come from a greater sector of the workforce, firstly, because we know that many of them go through a very specific route of private school and then, a specific kind of job to then end up in the House of Commons. But that having a foot in the real world, whether it be doing a bit of a job on part of the week and some of your parliamentary career the other part of the week, I don't think it's a mad suggestion. I think that part of the problem with politics at the moment is that Westminster has become a bubble. But not only that they are, when you talk about things like wage increases, when we talk about things like, how people voted, whether it's in relation to Brexit or whatever, there is this sort of blinkered view of how the rest of the country votes, works, eats, spends their leisure time.
But it is a professional job.
Of course.
So I don't see why, for instance, this is how our system works, why a doctor should necessarily make a great Secretary of State for Defence, or indeed a miner a Secretary of State for Health.
But this was, I think, where I get very populist, because I think that we have given up on the idea that your average Joe, even if they're a very experienced average Joe, like a neurosurgeon, can be involved in politics. Isn't the idea of a democracy that whatever your expertise, you don't have to have a PhD in PP from Oxford to be able to decide what route we take in relation to climate change initiatives or in relation to the economy. Politicians are supposed to be people who gather the information and the desires of their constituents and make informed decisions. But it strikes me that anyone could do that if they had a fair crack at the whip.
And they can stand for election. Anyone can stand for election.
I think that a little bit more in touch with the real world, even if that's the working real world, would do no harm to our politicians.
Well, there you go. Let me know your thoughts. And as we just said, anyone can stand for election. Of course, when you do, you know what the salary is going to be in advance. Anyway, next up, a Facebook whistleblower has told MPs that Instagram algorithms mean that bullying follows children into their bedrooms. That means that teenager Molly Russell, who viewed thousands of graphic images of self-harm and suicide in the 6 months before she took her own life at the age of 14 in 2017, would have been shown harmful content before she even started looking for it. Look, we go around this topic all the time, don't we? We nibble at the sides, and we always debate what social media companies should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. Francis Haugen has now revealed that tech bosses knew, apparently, that the app worsened youngsters' mental health. Let's just have a listen to that.
There's also an effect, which is a number of things are different about a life mediated by Instagram than what high school used to be like. So when I was in high school, it didn't matter if your experience at high school was horrible. Most kids had good homes to go home to. And they could, at the end of the day, disconnect. They would get a break for 16 hours. Facebook's own research says now the bullying follows children home. It goes into their bedrooms. The last thing they see at night is someone being cruel to them. The first thing they see in the morning is a hateful statement. And that is just so much worse.
Yeah, as I'm saying, it is a very sad case, especially the one we just heard about. But should social media companies be doing more, Ella?
No, and that's not because I don't feel incredibly distressed at the idea that young people are having access to such hateful and horrendous stuff online, and in particular the case, I mean, as many suicide charities and organisations would state ad nauseum, you cannot pin down something as terrible as suicide to one single explanation, and it would be incredibly crude to talk about suicide as simply being linked to things that someone saw on Instagram or so forth. However, in the context of widespread now, either from Parliament or from campaigners or indeed from people who are whistleblowing from Facebook, the idea that we need to do more to censor online content, what it really is about saying is that you give either big tech companies or the state the power to decide what is and isn't acceptable online. And if you move beyond the very sort of highly charged and emotional idea of what kids get exposed to, what you end up having is what we've seen over the last few years, and indeed actually seen today with Novara Media, the alternative news channel, being banned from YouTube and removed from YouTube. You have this intense mission creep, which is that censorship ends up being not just limited to hateful content, but limited to oppositional content or things that are controversial.
I'm sorry, I want to come on that. Apologies, I don't think censorship is a fair word in this context. I think it's restrictions. I think censorship is on grounds of taste or politics or decency. I don't think we're talking about censorship. I think we're talking about safeguards. We all accept, or whatever our perspective, this is quite a harrowing story, but the reason why Facebook is allowed to essentially proceed with a Wild West type attitude is money and lack of regulation.
And probably it needs something international. It's something I don't think that, because these companies, they don't respect national borders because they can't. They go everywhere. And one of the biggest problems that the online the harms bill that's going through Parliament at the moment is wrestling with is that the trouble with the social media companies is they're only liable for the content they're aware of. So there's no incentive to then go looking for dodgy content.
Have you ever tried to even mention the word? Like when I come on this show and I say, right, coming up today on the show, we'll be talking about vaccine passports. Within a nanosecond, I will have a warning slapped on my purse. Within a nanosecond.
But they're still missing an awful lot of stuff. And in fact, in the case of that young girl, is an example of the stuff that was getting through that they're actually missing. And the point I'm making is that whether you need some kind of international licensing or whatever, which is not censorship, but to make sure the safeguarding programmes they have in place are fit for purpose.
What about parenting?
Well,
because I find this fascinating. I mean, this story is awful, and I want to move on and not make it about the specifics of this little girl, because obviously I don't really know the ins and outs. But I find it astonishing, the number of parents who have children on social media, and they don't monitor what those children do on that social media. So we all sit here going, oh, these platforms are the Wild West, we've got to do safeguards, we've got to have duties of care and all the rest of it. But then parents don't even seem to safeguard their children against some of this stuff.
Well, I mean, it's very, it's tricky, and you wouldn't, it's very difficult being a parent today because you get the kids get given a tablet from school, and I used to read under my bed when my mum with the torch when my mum had turned out the light. I'm sure kids are able to sneak their phone into their bedrooms. It's not to play down the challenge that parents face, but it's an abstract question of how do we deal with the evils in society, whether it be people promoting self-harm content online, or indeed, extreme things like terrorist content, or people trolling people online. How do we deal with that as a society? And I think that it's a bit of a cop-out to suggest that we will just export that problem to big tech companies that use very blunt tools like algorithms to try and deal with this. In the case of children who are being bullied, I mean, just because you block the bully's content online, does that mean that the bullying is therefore, rendered neutral? I mean, it's still going on. It's still a problem to be talked about. I think it's weasel words to suggest that this this isn't censorship. It is censorship. And it is in allowing either governments or big tech companies who are unaccountable, undemocratic, to be able to control what we say online. Having age-appropriate limits is absolutely necessary, but I mean, how do you keep kids off the internet? More importantly is, do we believe in free speech? Do we believe in the ability for citizens to say what they want online? I think that we should have it with no ifs and no buts.
Ella, remember that phrase, the bullies follow you into the bedroom. I don't think that's Weasley.
Well, there you go.
True,
free speech. Should there be limits to free speech? Does that contradict the whole premise of free speech, if indeed there are? Is it censorship to try and protect a child from, well, I want to just call it vile, hatred, bullying, whatever you want to call it? Get in touch and let me know your thoughts. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the ULEZ charge. You might have heard of this, taking place in London. You might sit there and think, well, I don't really care because it's only London and I don't live there. But guess what? It's likely to be expanded to other cities very soon. I'll have all of that and more after the break. Hello there, welcome back. Now, this week, London's ultra-low emission zone, also known as ULEZ, which is what we'll call it for the purpose of this debate, the charge there expanded to within the north and south circulars of the capital. This has infuriated many motorists. Just to give you some context, the charge is £12.50 a day. You'll have to pay that if you've got a vehicle of a certain age. Now, if you sit there and you just think to yourself, well, that's just London, you know, who cares about London? I don't live in London. I've got some unfortunate news for you, because this isn't just a London story. Let's have a look at this map. You'll see that these things are planned to pop up pretty much everywhere. Do you see your city in that map? And I have to say, that's the current plans. Never say never, because I suspect that these things might be popping up much broader. Some Green campaigners are saying, for example, that it doesn't go far enough. Let's listen to my panel, get their views. Nigel, I'm going to start with you on this. Your thoughts on ULEZ? Are you supporting of it?
I'm very supportive. I used to be a climate change sceptic, and I am no longer. And as far as I can see, if we are going to make a good stab at getting to net zero by 2050, these are exactly the schemes you have to bring in. And yes, it would hit people with cars that don't meet the emission standards. That would tend to be, poorer people. Yeah. However, I think stopping people driving their cars in cities trumps anything else.
Do you?
And yeah, basically, that if we don't stop, we've got a whole host of things we've got to do, which a lot of it will come out of COP, but a whole host of things we have to do up to 2035. One of them has got to be to clean up our cities, and therefore pricing cars out of them is the best way forward.
Ella?
Well, I mean, I have a personal experience with this because my father, who's a builder all his life, and had a big van that when he bought it, it was 15 or so years ago, diesel van, met all the exemptions. He got the catalytic converter or whatever it is that, 2 of them got nicked off his van, did everything he could do. Now is having to be in forced retirement because if he drives the van, it's going to be £12.50, and try explaining that to a client who's already paying thousands for their new kitchen. And what this essentially is a poor tax. It means that people who are, working men and women who rely on vehicles to get around, whether it be builders, whether it be care workers, my husband's a tree surgeon, all these people are suddenly now having big chunks of their income removed, not just their assets in terms of a vehicle that has cost them thousands of pounds, but the future of their employment. It's a bit like the coronavirus discussion, whether you go for coercion or whether you go for resources. People driving, particularly in London, is an unpleasant experience because of traffic and all of that. I would love to go to the shops and get my weekly shop on the bus if it wasn't going to be crowded and if I didn't have to wait for half an hour for a bus to arrive. So why doesn't the government go for a massive push on increasing public transport, putting on double the number of trains, double the number of buses, having a big hiring spree in terms of getting people to work for them? Instead, they try and penalise people. This is a poor tax, but it's also, in line with the green narrative that everyone has to have less resources and have less in their life, and our lives have to be more miserable. And that is not what a government should be doing to its public.
Yeah, Peter, I've got to say, Nigel mentions that these initiatives are great because they match the tick the box of the climate agenda. Ella's given a good insight there in terms of the actual, almost, I'll call it an unintended consequence. So businesses being affected by things like this. To me, I have to say, it does feel like there's not much of a joined up approach. There's this obsession with we've got to do net zero, we've got to do climate, but then it's at what cost? Because if what Ella's saying, or Nigel was saying about public transport, so yes, fine, if you want to stop people going in to cities in their cars, that's fine if that's your objective, but then you have to provide suitable and reliable alternatives, which many would argue they don't.
OK, well, we've had a kind of tour de horizon, and I don't want to make everything party political, but these big public policy things where the impact over generations do go back to governments. And Ella made the point about can you improve public transport as an alternative to something like this. But remember, George Osborne, the Tory Chancellor, cut TfL central government funding to 0. So that answers, and then we had the pandemic subsequently. So that answers one of the questions about why TfL, which is limping along from bailout to bailout, can't increase their services. I think they're probably struggling to keep their services going. Ella's absolutely right. There is a cost impact on SMEs, but there's also a health impact now already happening. I think we all know the Times did a very good campaign, and I remember that stat about if you're a child growing up in the inner city, which is where I live, your lungs are going to be 10% smaller than a child growing up in the countryside. So there's economic costs, but there's health costs, and they're not health costs in the future. They are right now.
Well, just in case you're wondering, is my car affected by that? Most petrol cars registered from 2005 onwards are generally exempt, as are most diesel cars registered after September 2015. Lots of you guys have been getting in contact. Paul on email says that no, he doesn't think MPs should have second jobs. They should, in his mind, stick to the politics, which is why they went into the job in the first place. Lots of people getting in to say that £82,000 to £2,000 a year is absolutely money that they could live on and would be enough for them. Steve says there's too many MPs. And I think that's a theme that's coming through as well. Do we need 650 MPs? Steve on social media says, why do we talk about social media as though we need it? He says, you don't need it, it's not mandated. Why don't you just turn it off? I've got to say, Steve, I think if you see some of the kids of today, I think they're absolutely glued. You would think that some of their mobile phones have been glued to the palm of their hands. I would be fascinated to see how many of them would just turn social media off. Anyway, that is pretty much all we've got time for. Time flies, doesn't it? Every single one of these debates we could continue with. But before I do go, I'm intrigued about this. I saw a story that made me laugh. Would you serve your guests potato milk to... Yeah, potato milk. I didn't even know it was such a thing, to reduce CO2 emissions. This, of course, is a study by Waitrose. Firstly, I didn't even know potato milk was a thing. Secondly, no, I wouldn't serve it. Very briefly, one-word answers. Would you serve it to your guests, potato milk, yes or no?
I try everything, but probably not.
No?
Depends what it tastes like.
Depends what it tastes like.
No, I'd give them a vegetarian diet instead.
Vegetarian diet instead. Oh, well, there you go. Would you serve people that came to your house potato milk? I think if I did that, some of the people that come to mind, they would look at me as though I was bonkers, that is for sure. Anyway, that is it for tonight. I will be back the same time tomorrow. Thank you for your company. Lots of you still getting in touch. These guys have got you talking tonight. You can continue getting in touch if there's anything else you want us to cover on a future show. But for now, Ella, Nigel, Peter, thank you very much for your company. Thank you for yours. Have yourself a very good evening, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Hello, we've got some very unsettled weather across the UK over the next few days. Heavy rain at times with Met Office weather warnings in place. Windy too, and those winds are coming in from the southwest, so it is very mild, as you can see on the pressure pattern. Now, we're keeping an eye on this weather front here because that's going to give some persistent rain through the next few days. The risk of some flooding, weather warnings are in place across northern England, southern Scotland and Wales. That weather front is currently across Northern Ireland and Scotland as we go through Tuesday evening into Wednesday, gradually sinking its way southwards. A lot of cloud in the sky, winds in from the southwest and very mild for the time of year. These are your overnight temperatures into Wednesday, more typical of what we would see through the daytime at this stage in October. So through Wednesday morning then, it's southern Scotland, northern England that sees the brunt of the rain. Will be quite persistent, I think, through the day here. And that just allows those totals to build up, so the risk of some difficult travelling conditions. A lot of cloud elsewhere, a few breaks in that cloud to the east of the Pennines, across southeast England as well. Some brighter skies later across the northwest with 1 or 2 showers, but highs of 18 degrees, very mild for this stage of October. As we go through Wednesday evening then, that rain gradually sinks into Wales and pushes its way a little bit further south with some very strong winds on that. We could see gusts of 30 to 40 miles an hour at times. Another rain warning then comes into force for Wales through Thursday as we see that rain starting to become more persistent here. Still very, very mild though across the bulk of the country. A little bit cooler across the northwest of Scotland as we see that cooler, fresher air starting to push its way in here. But as we go through Thursday, more of the same for western areas. Do take care if you are travelling because there will be some difficult driving conditions out there. We're expecting that rain to persist through much of the day. Elsewhere, some brighter skies. And as we go through Friday and into the Halloween weekend, it stays unsettled and turns just that little bit cooler. Take care for now. Bye-bye.